I've tried to explain it so many times, but no one ever believes me. They look at me like I'm some madman, a shell of whatever I used to be, and maybe they're right. Maybe I'm as hollow as they think I am. But that doesn't change what happened out there. It doesn't erase the things I saw, the things I felt. If they could only step inside my head for a second, they'd understand why I wake up every night gasping for air like I'm drowning. They'd know that some things don't leave you, no matter how far you run. The journal's still with me. It's battered and warped from the salt air, but the words inside are intact. I've read them 1,000 times, and yet, every time I open it, it feels like a stranger wrote them. Like the man who scribbled down those notes is long gone, dragged beneath the waves along with the others. And maybe he is. Maybe I'm all that's left. We called it the Northern Belle. The name didn't suit her, not really. There was nothing graceful or charming about that ship. She was old and tired, held together by rust and patches of steel that groaned with every wave. But she was ours, or at least she belonged to the captain. We were just the bodies that kept her afloat, a ragtag crew of men who had run out of options. Nobody came aboard the Belle because they wanted to. We all had our reasons, but none of them were good. The first thing you noticed was the smell. It clung to you like a second skin, a mix of diesel, fish guts, and damp rot that never really went away. The walls inside the cabins were streaked with grease, the floors always felt sticky, and no matter how many layers you wore, the cold found its way through. It wasn't a place to live. It was a place to endure. The crew wasn't much better. There were 6 of us, not counting the captain. None of us had much to say to each other unless it was necessary. Frank, the oldest among us, was the quiet type, always fiddling with his pocket knife or staring out at the horizon like he was waiting for something. Then there was Eddie, a loudmouth who never stopped complaining but always seemed to know how to fix whatever was broken. Charlie was the youngest, barely out of his teens, and skittish as a cat. He'd flinch if you so much as sneezed near him. The others, well, they were just faces I'd grown used to seeing. We weren't friends. We were just stuck together. The captain, he was different. He didn't talk much either, but when he did, you listened. There was something in his voice that told you he'd seen things. Things he wasn't going to share but expected you to understand. He spent most of his time in the wheelhouse, staring at his charts like they held some secret he was trying to unravel. I don't think any of us trusted him completely, but he paid us, and that was enough. The first few days were uneventful. The same routines, the same grumbling, the same gray horizon stretching out in every direction. Nights were the worst, though. Out there, under the black sky, it felt like the ocean was alive. The waves would slap against the hull, and the wind would whistle through the cracks, but there was something else. A hum. Faint at first, so faint you'd think it was your imagination. But it was there, just below the surface of the usual noises. None of us mentioned it, not at first. Maybe we didn't want to admit we'd heard it. It was on the 4th day that things started to change. We'd been hauling in nets all morning, cursing the cold and each other, when we snagged something heavy. At first, we thought it was just a good catch, maybe a school of fish packed tighter than usual. But as we cranked the winch, the tension in the air grew thicker. Eddie was the first to notice it, the way his face twisted into something I hadn't seen before. Fear. When the net broke the surface, it wasn't fish we saw. There was fish, sure, but tangled among them was something else. A box, small and battered, crusted over with barnacles and seaweed. It looked ancient, like it had been sitting on the ocean floor for centuries. The captain's eyes lit up when he saw it, and for the first time since we'd left port, he seemed genuinely excited. "Get it on board," he barked, and we did as we were told, though none of us wanted to touch the thing. Once it was on the deck, the captain inspected it closely. His hands ran over the surface, brushing away the muck until faint markings began to emerge. symbols we didn't recognize. That was when Frank spoke up for the first time in days. "We should toss it back," he muttered, his voice low but firm. The captain shot him a look that could have frozen fire. "It stays," he said, and that was the end of it. That night, the hum grew louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a feeling, like something pressing against your chest, squeezing the air out of your lungs. I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, every creak of the ship making me flinch. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Eddie's voice, muffled and angry. He was arguing with someone, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it went quiet. The whispers came next. I don't know how else to describe them. They were faint, like the wind was carrying bits of conversation that didn't belong to us. I thought I was imagining it until I saw Charlie sitting up in his bunk, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked at me and said, "Do you hear it?" I nodded, but neither of us spoke again. We just sat there, listening to the whispers until sleep finally took us. The next morning, the box was gone. The captain had locked it in his cabin, refusing to let anyone near it. He didn't explain why, and we didn't ask. But there was a tension among us now, a quiet unease that settled over the ship like a fog. Even Eddie had stopped complaining. It was like we were all waiting for something, though none of us knew what it was. The days blurred together after that. The hum never went away, and the whispers came and went like waves, growing stronger each night. Some of the crew started having headaches, bad ones that made them wince and clutch their temples. Frank stopped eating, and Charlie started muttering to himself when he thought no one was listening. The captain, though, seemed unfazed. He spent his time poring over his charts, mumbling things none of us could understand. Then came the storm. It wasn't on any forecast, and it hit us out of nowhere. The wind howled like a living thing, and the waves slammed against the hull so hard it felt like the ship would split in two. We scrambled to secure the deck, slipping and sliding on the wet steel as rain pelted us from every direction. The captain shouted orders from the wheelhouse, his voice barely audible over the chaos. And through it all, the hum was still there, growing louder, deeper, until it felt like the whole ocean was vibrating. When the storm finally passed, we were left battered and bruised, but alive. The bell had taken a beating, though. One of the cranes was bent at an odd angle, and the winch was jammed. We spent the next day making repairs, but something had shifted among us. The whispers were louder now, almost clear. And that night, I dreamed of the box. I saw it sitting on the deck, the symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. The lid creaked open, and inside was... I don't know. I woke up before I could see it, my heart pounding and my breath coming in short gasps. When I looked over at Charlie, he was already awake, staring at me like he knew exactly what I'd dreamed. None of us talked about it the next day. We went about our work in silence, the hum and whispers our constant companions. The captain stayed in his cabin, the door locked tight. Eddie tried to joke about it, tried to lighten the mood, but his laughter sounded hollow. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us were ready to admit it. The sea felt different now. The waves seemed sharper, the water darker. Even the air was heavier, like it was pressing down on us. And then, on the seventh day, the net snagged again. They told us the sea held mysteries, but none of us were ready for what we found that day. The net came up heavy again, straining against the winch, the groan of metal stretching across the deck. We had all been tense since the first catch, and now that weight, whatever it was, pulled at something inside us too. Eddie was at the controls, muttering under his breath, his usual complaints drowned out by the screech of the winch. The rest of us stood there, bracing ourselves, waiting for the net to break the surface. It felt like we were holding our breath, the world suspended in that moment. Then it appeared, rising from the water like a ghost. Fish spilled out in a writhing heap, but they weren't what caught our attention. Tangled in the mess of seaweed and scales was her. Pale as the moon, her skin too smooth, too cold. She was lifeless, or at least that's what I thought at first. Her lips were sewn shut with wire, corroded and jagged, biting into her flesh. And yet, her chest moved. Shallow, uneven breaths, but unmistakable. Nobody spoke at first. We just stood there, staring. Then Charlie made a noise, a sharp intake of breath, and stepped back like he'd been burned. Eddie froze, his hands still on the controls, his face drained of all color. Frank crossed himself, his lips moving silently, but no one else moved. It was the captain who broke the silence. "Get her on board," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. But it cracked, just a little, at the end. We can't," Charlie stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at her. I said get her on board." The captain shouted, louder this time, and something in his tone made us obey. Reluctantly, we worked together to haul her onto the deck. Her body was cold to the touch, slick with seawater, and heavier than she looked. We laid her down gently, though every instinct screamed at me to let go and step back. She didn't move. Not at first. Her chest rose and fell, but her limbs stayed limp, her eyes closed. I thought maybe she was dead after all, maybe the breath was some trick of the sea. Then the hum started. It was faint at first, just like before. But this time, it wasn't coming from the ocean. It was coming from her. Her lips didn't move, but the sound grew, a low vibration that seemed to sink into my bones. Eddie dropped his wrench with a clatter, clutching his ears. "What is that?" he whispered, but no one answered. Then her eyes opened. They weren't normal. They weren't right. Wide, empty, staring past us like we weren't there at all. Her lips, still sealed, began to quiver, and the hum deepened, shifting into something more. A note, a tone that wrapped around us, filling the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, inside and out, pressing against my skull. Frank was the first to break. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling, his eyes locked on her face. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying over that sound. Eddie started pacing, muttering to himself, his words syncing with the hum in a way that made my stomach turn. Charlie just stood there, frozen, his face wet with tears he didn't seem to realize he was shedding. The captain stayed back, watching from the wheelhouse, his face pale but determined. He wasn't coming down to us. He didn't have to deal with what was happening, not directly. But he kept shouting orders over the intercom, his voice cracking more with each command. "Secure her. Get her below deck." Nobody moved to do it. We were all stuck in place, rooted by something more than fear. Then Frank stood, slowly, his movements jerky, like he wasn't in full control. He turned toward the edge of the deck, his step steady, deliberate. None of us reacted at first. It didn't register what he was doing until he reached the railing. "Frank!" I shouted, finally snapping out of my daze. But he didn't stop. He didn't even turn his head. He climbed over the railing with an ease that didn't make sense, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. And then he was gone. One moment there, the next swallowed by the sea. Eddie screamed. He ran to the edge, leaning over, calling Frank's name, but there was nothing. No sign of him, no splash, no struggle. Just the water, calm and endless. Eddie looked back at us, his face twisted in a mix of anger and despair. "Why didn't you stop him?" he shouted, but none of us had an answer. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I felt it crawling under my skin. I wanted to run, to get as far away as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. Then Charlie started screaming. It was high-pitched and frantic, like a wounded animal, and it snapped Eddie out of whatever trance he'd been in. He grabbed Charlie by the shoulders, shaking him. "Stop it. Just stop." Charlie's screams turned into sobs, and he collapsed to the deck, clutching his head. Eddie looked at me, his eyes wide, desperate. "What do we do?" he asked, but I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, but this time it wasn't an order. It was a ramble, disjointed and frantic. He was talking about charts, about destiny, about something he called the reckoning. I couldn't make sense of it, but it chilled me to my core. He wasn't in control anymore, not of himself, not of us, not of anything. The next hours blurred together. The hum never stopped, growing louder and more complex, weaving patterns in the air that made my head spin. The crew began to unravel. Eddie smashed the winch with a hammer, shouting that it was cursed. Charlie locked himself in the engine room, crying and muttering to someone who wasn't there. And me? I just tried to keep breathing, one shallow gulp of air at a time. I found the logbook by accident. It was tucked in a corner of the storage room, covered in dust and grime, the pages yellowed and brittle. I almost didn't open it, but something drew me to it. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough. "The sea always takes its due," it said, over and over, scrawled in the margins like a mantra. The entries were brief, fragmented, but they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Another ship, another crew, another strange find pulled from the depths. And just like us, they'd been consumed by something they couldn't understand. When I closed the book, the hum seemed louder, as if it knew what I'd read. My hands were shaking, my mind racing, but I knew one thing for sure. We were never going to make it back. The silence didn't last. It never did. When the hum stopped, it left behind a void so deep it felt louder than the sound itself. I sat there, staring at the rust-streaked walls of the cabin, waiting for the next wave of madness to hit. My ears were still ringing from the last surge, the echoes of it crawling beneath my skin. Every creak of the ship, every groan of the hull, sent a shiver through me. But then came the quiet, sharp and unnatural, as if the sea itself had paused to listen. I don't remember deciding to leave the cabin. My legs carried me to the deck like they belonged to someone else. The air was thick and damp, clinging to my face, and the dim light of the overcast sky turned everything a sickly gray. I stumbled forward, my hands gripping the rail for support. That's when I saw them. They were just beneath the surface, pale heads bobbing in unison, their faces smooth and expressionless. The water barely rippled around them, as though they weren't part of the ocean at all but something else entirely. Their mouths opened and closed in perfect sync, and though the sound wasn't loud, it was everywhere. The melody they sang wasn't music, it was something older, something that didn't belong in this world. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Their eyes locked onto me, and I felt the pull again, that same irresistible force that had taken Frank, that had driven Eddie to smash the winch, that had turned Charlie into a trembling wreck. It was like they were calling me, their song burrowing into my brain, overriding everything else. My grip on the rail tightened until my knuckles turned white. I told myself not to listen, not to give in, but their faces, those faces wouldn't let me go. Behind me, I heard footsteps, heavy and uneven. I turned my head just enough to see the others, what was left of them. Two of the crew had made it to the deck, their faces pale, their movements erratic. One of them held a wrench, the other a length of rope. They looked at me, then at the girl lying on the deck, her body still and her lips sealed, yet her voice filled the air. "We have to stop her," one of them said, his voice shaking. "We have to make it stop." They moved toward her, their steps uneven, their faces twisted with fear and desperation. The man with the wrench raised it high, but before he could bring it down, the song changed. It rose in pitch, sharp and piercing, like shards of glass being dragged across stone. The man froze, the wrench slipping from his fingers. He clutched his head, his mouth opening in a silent scream, and then he turned the wrench on himself. I looked away, but the sound. I'll never forget the sound. The other man dropped the rope and stumbled back, his eyes wide, his breaths shallow and rapid. He backed away until he hit the railing, his hands gripping it like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "She's in my head," he whispered, over and over, his voice breaking. "She's in my head." I wanted to tell him to stop, to hold on, but the words caught in my throat. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and then he was gone, over the side and into the water. The pale heads beneath the waves turned toward him as he sank, their song shifting again, deeper, more resonant. I felt it in my chest, a vibration that made my ribs ache. The girl's eyes opened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something there, not emptiness, but awareness. She was looking at me, really looking, and in that instant, I knew she wasn't a victim. She wasn't some poor soul trapped by the sea. She was part of it, a piece of something vast and ancient and cruel. Memories, or maybe hallucinations, started to flood my mind. Images of rituals on rocky shores, figures in dark robes chanting as the waves crashed around them. The girl was there, her face younger, her lips unmarked, but her eyes just as hollow. They'd offered her to the sea, and the sea had taken her. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between the past and the present. The song didn't stop, but it faded enough for me to hear footsteps again. I turned to see the captain emerging from the wheelhouse, his face gaunt, his hands clutching a rolled-up map. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the girl. "It's her," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "She's the key. She'll save us." I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him see what was really happening. But he wasn't listening. He unrolled the map and spread it out on the deck, his hands tracing lines and symbols that didn't make sense. The map wasn't like any I'd seen before. It was covered in markings, spirals and runes and jagged lines that seemed to shift when I looked at them. The captain muttered to himself, his words disjointed, fragments of thoughts that didn't connect. Then he stopped and looked up at me. "It has to be done," he said, his eyes wild. "This is the only way." I didn't understand what he meant until he stepped toward the railing. "No!" I shouted, reaching for him, but he was already climbing over. He turned to face me, his expression calm, almost serene. "The sea takes what it's owed," he said, and then he let go. I ran to the edge, my hands gripping the rail, but he was gone. The water churned where he'd fallen, and the heads beneath the surface began to move again, their song growing louder, more chaotic. "IBA. Get away," my heart pounding, my mind racing. I was alone now, the last one left. The ship was silent except for the hum, which seemed to echo through every corner, every crack. I wandered aimlessly, my feet dragging across the deck, my thoughts a tangled mess. I ended up in the captain's cabin, though I don't remember deciding to go there. The map was still on the table, the lines and symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. His logbook was open beside it, the pages filled with scrawled notes and diagrams. He'd known, I realized. He'd known about her, about the song, about everything. The last entry in his log was just one line, written over and over, "The sea always takes its due." I knew there was no escaping it. The song was everywhere, sinking into the metal of the ship, seeping through the cracks, wrapping itself around me like a net I couldn't break free from. My ears bled from the effort of trying to block it out, stuffing rags and anything else I could find against my head. But the sound wasn't just outside me anymore. It was inside, curling through my mind like a living thing, feeding off every memory, every thought. I stumbled across the deck, past the blood streaks that seemed to lead nowhere. My feet slid on the slick steel, but I barely noticed. The world had shrunk to the size of that sound, a hum that was now so loud it drowned out my own thoughts. The others were gone. I knew that much. Whether they'd gone into the sea or something else had taken them, I couldn't say. Their screams had long since faded, leaving me alone with the weight of what we'd done. The cold storage container loomed ahead, a steel box that offered nothing but stillness and darkness. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. I yanked the door open and stepped inside, the chill wrapping around me like a second skin. My breath misted in the air, and my hands shook as I gathered every scrap of insulation I could find. Duct tape, old rags, pieces of rubber. I piled them on my head, layer after layer, until the pressure on my skull was almost unbearable. The song didn't stop. It was quieter now, muffled, but it was still there, a faint thread weaving through the silence. I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest. My fingers clutched at the fabric of my jacket, nails digging into the seams. Time stretched and twisted, the minutes blurring into hours, the hours into something else. There was no clock, no marker of how long I'd been there. Only the cold and the song and the weight of everything I'd seen. The faces of the crew drifted in and out of my mind, their voices mixing with the hum. Frank, with his quiet steadiness. Eddie, always muttering complaints but ready to jump in when something needed fixing. Charlie, too young for the kind of fear he'd carried in his eyes. And the captain. I didn't know what to make of him anymore. He'd known something, that much was clear. His maps, his mutterings, the strange symbols scrawled across his charts, they weren't the ramblings of a man caught by surprise. He'd brought us here, whether by accident or design, and now the sea had taken him too. I don't know when I realized the song had stopped. It wasn't sudden, it faded, slipping away like a shadow retreating from the light. At first, I thought it was a trick, that it would surge back as soon as I let my guard down. But the silence held, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. I waited, my breath shallow, my hands trembling as they hovered over the insulation around my head. Slowly, I began peeling it away, the sound of the tape ripping almost deafening in the stillness. When the last layer came off, I sat there, listening to the silence, my heart pounding in the quiet. I didn't trust it. I didn't trust anything. But there was no hum, no whisper of that terrible melody. Just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven. I stayed there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid that any action might bring it back. It was the banging that finally forced me out. A distant thudding, echoing through the ship, steady and deliberate. At first, I thought it was in my head, another trick of the song. But it grew louder, more insistent, and then I heard voices. Real voices. Human voices. I stumbled to my feet, my legs numb from the cold, my hands fumbling for the latch on the container door. When it swung open, the light outside blinded me, and I staggered back, shielding my eyes. They were there, silhouetted against the gray sky, men in bright orange suits with helmets and gloves. A rescue team. One of them stepped forward, his face partially obscured by his gear, but his voice was clear. "You're safe now," he said, his tone gentle but uncertain. I couldn't answer him. My throat was raw, my mind a tangled mess of images and sounds. They pulled me out of the container, their hands firm but careful, guiding me toward their vessel. The air outside was frigid, the wind biting at my skin, but it felt cleaner somehow, less oppressive. The ship's deck was empty now, save for the stains and the marks left behind. No bodies. No signs of the crew. Just me. They gave me a blanket, wrapped it around my shoulders as I sat on the deck of their ship, staring out at the horizon. The questions came, of course. What happened? Where was the crew? How long had I been out here? I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain something that didn't make sense, even to me? I mumbled fragments, words that felt hollow and meaningless. They listened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. The captain of their ship approached me, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a voice that carried the weight of too many years at sea. He asked the same questions, his tone kinder but no less probing. I tried to tell him about the girl, about the song, about the heads beneath the waves. But the words stuck in my throat, and when they did come out, they sounded ridiculous, even to me. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, and walked away. As the hours passed, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a crushing exhaustion that made my limbs feel like lead. I leaned against the rail, my eyes half closed, my thoughts drifting. The northern belle was still visible in the distance, a dark shape against the pale water. It looked smaller now, almost insignificant. But as I stared at it, something moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the shifting waves. But then I saw her. The girl. She stood on the deck of the belle, her pale form stark against the dark metal. Her eyes, once blank, were now focused, fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear the song. Not yet. But I knew it was there, waiting, just below the surface. I turned away, squeezing my eyes shut, but the image of her was burned into my mind. When I opened them again, she was gone. The ship was empty, as it should have been. But the unease didn't leave me. It clung to me, a weight I couldn't shake. The rescue team didn't notice anything. They went about their tasks, preparing to leave, their voices low and steady. I tried to focus on them, on their normalcy, but the wind carried something else. A sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A hum. It drifted across the water, weaving through the air, growing stronger with each passing second. I looked at the crew, wondering if they heard it too. One of them paused, his head tilting slightly, his expression puzzled. Another glanced toward the horizon, his brow furrowed. They didn't say anything, but I could see it in their faces. They felt it. They just didn't understand it yet. The ship's engines roared to life, the vibrations humming through the deck beneath me. I gripped the rail, my knuckles white, my breath shallow. The northern belle faded into the distance, swallowed by the mist, but the hum stayed with us. It was in the wind, in the water, in the very fabric of the air around us. And as I sat there, the blanket pulled tight around me, I realized it would never leave. The last thing I saw before the mist closed in was her face, pale and unyielding, her lips moving in a silent song that only I could hear. And then there was nothing but the hum, steady and unrelenting, as the world faded to gray. If you're listening to this, if my words make it to you somehow, remember this: some things are better left in the deep. Turn away. Don't listen. Whatever the sea gives, it takes back. And it always takes more.